You will not be part of that recording unless you unmute and speak into your microphone. So if you don't want to be on the recording, don't worry, you're not. When we get to the audience question and answer period, if you want to ask a question, you can type it into the chat and either Davith or I will read it out for you. If you want to ask a question on camera and be part of the recording and memorialized forever, you can absolutely do that. Just go ahead and send a message to me or to Davith, or put a note in the chat to everyone, whichever is easiest for you, and we will let you know when it's time to unmute and ask. That's enough of the boring details. I'm super excited about this evening's event. Our author tonight is going to be interviewed by Benjamin Madley. He is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles, which is his beautiful background this evening, where he focuses on Native America, the United States, and genocide in world history. He is the author of An American Genocide, the United States, and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846-1883. Edward Melillo is Professor of History and Environmental Studies at Amherst College. He is the author of Strangers on Familiar Soil, Rediscovering the Chile-California Connection, which won the Western History Association's 2016 Coy Prize for the most distinguished book on the American West. He was awarded the Mellon New Directions Fellowship in 2017, and he is with us tonight to talk about his newest book, The Butterfly Effect, Insects and the Making of the Modern World. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you so much to Northshire Books for having me. Can everyone hear me? Good, good. Ben, do you want to take the first stab or shall I begin?
Sure, you ready for some questions?
Maybe I'll talk about the book for just a brief moment and give it some context. I also want to thank my really good friend, Ben Madley, for being willing to do this. He and I have known each other for about, we're going on 20 years, I think. We first met at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley, California, when we were graduate students working on our doctoral dissertations. And since then, we've had a really good time traveling the world talking about history. So thank you, Ben, for being willing to do this tonight. I'll tell you a little bit about my book, The Butterfly Effect, Insects and the Making of the Modern World. It's been a wild ride. It's been a joy to write this book because it's been such an unorthodox exploration for me into the world of the beneficial effects that insects have had on humanity throughout history. There's been a lot written about all the detrimental effects that insects have had on humans in the past, and that's understandable. Insects are the carriers of devastating diseases. One can think of malaria, Zika, West Nile virus, dengue fever, and insects destroy a massive number of the world's crops and services each year. In fact, farmers spend about 16 billion US dollars annually fighting insects around the world. But I wanted to write a different book and try to come up with the ways that insects actually have benefited humanity in the past. And as I did the research for the book, I was actually quite surprised by the litany of ways in which this is true. The book is a two-part book. The first half of it deals with 3 insect commodities in world history that really have shaped our reality in the past, but also in the present in so many ways. And we'll get into those tonight. Those are shellac, cochineal, and silk. And we'll talk about those quite a bit more in a bit. The second half of the book deals with what I call the Laboratories of Modernity. And those are the institutions, the places, and the people who are really at the heart of many modern projects like genetic science, agribusiness, and the future of food. And I look into the ways that insects and insect bodies have been at the very heart of those projects. So the book is very wide-ranging in its geography and its time frame, and it really has spoken to my identity as a global historian of the environment. I do what's called environmental history. I teach environmental history at Amherst College, and it really involves the exploration of the ways that people have understood and interacted with nature throughout history. And so this book, in many ways, is both about the coming of that field and the emergence of many ideas that I've harbored for a long time, and all those coalesced in the present volume. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ben to ask a few questions. We'll chat for a little while about the book, and then we'd be happy to entertain questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ted. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be back in the Northeast, albeit virtually. I used to live in Vermont and teach at Dartmouth College, and it's nice to see all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. So when Ted and I first met, we were in a kind of giant warehouse of archives, and Ted was burrowing deeply into sources, trying to find and trace all of the environmental historical connections linking the state of California with the country of Chile in South America, looking at the ways in which these two very distant spaces were connected through the transportation of crops and ideas between two similar environmental spaces, both with Mediterranean climates. So my first question, Ted, and this isn't really something that we've talked about in all of our discussions about this book, is how did you make this jump from writing a book about the California-Chile connection, which is a relatively discrete project, to this really expansive project that spans the entire globe and really millennia of time? How did that happen?
Well, I do have a predilection for big history. The first book, on the Chile-California connection, Strangers on Familiar Soils, does span 222 years of interactions between Chile and the state of California. And one of the main themes in that book is about the movement of commodities between the two places. I look at the movement of alfalfa from Chile to California, the making of the California waterfront from Chilean ships, the movement of miners and technologies. And there's some similar themes that really animate this book. Once again, I'm looking at the global trade of insect commodities, and I'll talk about shellac and cochineal and silk later as we get into our discussion. But I've always been fascinated by trade networks and the global circulation of products and people across the past. And it's a course that I've taught for a long time at Amherst, and then before that at Oberlin College and at Franklin and Marshall College, that really was the seedbed for this project. It's a course called Commodities, Nature, and Society, in which students and I explore the history of silver, silk, coffee, tobacco, sneakers, microchips, units of bandwidth, and human body parts in world history. And we have a lot of fun, and the students for that course do a final project on a commodity of their choosing. And they follow the environmental and historical linkages of that commodities trade in the past. And many years ago at Oberlin College, a student of mine did a project on shellac. And at the time, I'd not known this, but shellac is the main substance in 78 RPM long-playing records that preceded the vinyl era of records that starts in the 1940s. And a little light went on in my head because I had known about cochineal, which is a bug that's the source of the main red dye used throughout Europe and much of the world to dye clothing during the Renaissance and the early modern era. And I had known quite a bit about silk. I was trained as a Chinese historian at the beginning of my graduate school years. But once I added shellac to the mix, I had this trio of insect commodities that I was thinking about. And so commodity histories and the movement and trade of products has spanned both projects as a theme and really began to emerge as I thought more about this trio of silk, shellac, and cochineal. The other big theme that I think unites both projects is much of my career has been spent thinking about how people come to know nature or non-human nature. And in many ways that happens through labor. It sometimes happens through leisure. It can happen through trade. It can sometimes happen through nationality. We know our nation often through species of plants and animals. And really digging deep into that question of how we come to know non-human nature in the past has animated my work for several decades now. So those are the unifying themes. The topics may vary across these books, but there are a lot of guiding principles that are operating in the background here.
So this morning I was on my morning hike through Will Rogers State Park, and once again I saw the cochineal bugs on the cacti that Mexican cattle movers brought up from Mexico and planted on his ranch. And I was just thinking about the bugs, and I was thinking, you know, my colleagues in biology here at UCLA would have written a very different book, I think, from a scientific perspective. But trained as a historian, I suspect that your direction is very, very different. And I wonder if you could speak to the ways in which, since you are somebody who can kind of walk in both worlds, the world of hard biological and chemical and physical science and the world of narrative history, how do you think the questions that you asked and the way that you investigated the positive relationships between humans and insects are different than what a scientist might have written had they tackled this topic?
Thanks, that's a great question. My folks are on the call here, and in part what I'm doing is I'm intertwining two limbs of the family tree in my work, because my father's an ecologist and my mother is a history and an English teacher. So I've always seen the humanities, social sciences, and hard sciences as fundamentally intertwined from the get-go. And I've tried to carry that into my work in ways that I think are really fruitful and productive. Maybe cross-pollination is the appropriate metaphor there. One of the things I try to do as a historian is really dig deep into the primary sources, so that I'm not reading texts through the filter of another person's interpretation. I want to get into those texts firsthand in a way that maybe a journalist or a scientist might not be as interested in doing. And so folks who read this book, I hope will notice that I've done a lot of work with texts in Spanish, in French, and even a few, I had to actually translate something short, and it was painstaking, from Chinese. I had to dust off my rusty Chinese and work with that as well. And part of the reason I think that's so important as a historian is that I then get to be the interpreter of those texts and sources. And I get to be the first weaver of those tapestries that become the stories. And it's that prioritization of those primary sources, those firsthand documents created in the times and the places I'm writing about, that really is fundamental to my methods. Now, I've been really fortunate, and I've been able to do ecological field work with my dad all over the world: China, northern Sweden, the Harvard forest in western Massachusetts. So I've got some experience in the world of ecology, and I also import a lot from the world of literature. There's a whole bunch of poetry in this book because I'm so excited about thinking beyond our traditional lenses of how insects have entered culture. So I'm trying to bring all these different methods together in new ways, but fundamentally I'm a historian. First and foremost, I'm really fascinated by getting to those original texts and digging my heels in and having fun with this forensic part of the detective story behind all of these tales that I tell.
Were there any revelations that came to you as a product of doing your own translations?
Oh yeah, I really struggled to translate the French journals of a fascinating character, Nicolas Joseph Thierry de Menonville, who was a French biopirate. He was a botanist who snuck into Spanish Mexico. It was the Viceroyalty of New Spain at the time, in 1776. And he absconded with cochineal bugs, the ones you were talking about seeing on your walk, and nopal cacti, which is what these insects eat, and snuck them out of Mexico and brought them to Saint-Domingue, which later becomes Haiti. It was a French colony at the time. The Spanish had a monopoly on cochineal, and so the French were desperate to get this source of red dye and control the production zone of their own. And I translated his journals from the original French, and there were a number of twists and turns to the translation, because there have been many previous translations done of his texts, but as I looked through each of them, they rendered the journal entries quite differently. And so I had to struggle. It was an enjoyable struggle, I'll say, with some of the terms and the ways to render them. There was one case in which he was hitching a ride on a Spanish ship back to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, and he hides the cochineal insects in a little bundle and pretends that he's creating a new medicine for people who are suffering from the gout. And one of the things he says is that he'd added a little linen from the Shroud of Turin to the mix to make it work more effectively. And two people had previously translated the French term as lint. And I thought to myself, that's not right, it's really linen. And so one of the joys of the project was working with these original texts and getting to play around with previous versions of the translations and both the inaccuracies and the kind of exciting twists that one can put on a translation when you work with the original text. I mean, there is that famous Italian phrase, traduttore, traditore, the translator is a traitor, but the translator indeed gets a lot of latitude over how to render the final product. And that is really one of the joys of working with primary sources as a historian, especially working in another language, is the playfulness with which you can then approach the final outcome.
So Ted, your book takes us deep into the histories of a wide variety of far-flung locations and times, ranging from Japan under the shogunate to Spanish Mexico and even to ancient China. And I notice reading the book for a second time that you're constantly changing elevations. Sometimes you're way up high and we're seeing the world from 35,000 feet. And then sometimes we're right down in there with somebody and we're learning about their very particular personal experiences and who they are and even what motivates them emotionally and ethically. How did you make the decisions of when to be way up high and when to take us as readers right in close to the person?
Well, I'll admit part of that is trial and error in crafting a narrative. Another part of it, though, and I need to give props to him, is it's the work of a great editor. I have a wonderful editor who has really helped me figure out how to shape those transitions. You need to do deep dives to get people excited about history. There needs to be the granularity and the particularity that people can actually relate to faraway places and faraway times. But one also needs to be able to toggle up and look at things synoptically so that we can get an overview and situate ourselves, especially when doing global history, about long distance interchanges and processes that take place over extremely long periods of time. And so working out when to toggle and how to toggle is both the product of my experimentation as an author, but also the product of some great editing. I do also think it's the result of something I'm trying to do in the book. There's a quote I love, I believe it comes from the French theorist Louis Althusser, where he says, "Theory should be like the stitches in a finely tailored suit. They're holding everything together, but you don't want to see them." And I tend to approach theory that way. It needs to be structuring the entire narrative. And fundamentally, it's the scaffolding, the skeleton for a book. But if you see too much of it, it becomes a burden. And then working your way through the book is more onerous than joyful. And so part of the moving back and forth among scales is a way to deal with that. There's some big claims the book is making, but I don't want those to be intimidating or off-putting to someone who may know nothing about insects or history for that matter. And so by moving among scales and thinking about the particular and the general, I'm trying to move people through my arguments in a way that's more approachable.
So I want to ask a follow-up question about how you make narrative work in history. Along with all the different fascinating insects that you introduce us to in this book, you also take us up close to a variety of characters. Two of the people that really strike me as highly memorable are the Dutch artist and her daughter, who basically sell everything and go to Suriname to paint and study and draw insects for the better part of several years. How did you choose which people you follow and decide to render in such vivid detail? how do you make those choices? Who to include and who not to include?
Well, it's always tricky because a lot of good material ends up on the cutting room floor, as it were. And one could probably write 8 more books out of all that material. You know this from your own work, and you and I have talked about this quite extensively. And we're actually planning to probably write a few books based on all that extra material. But the people whose stories end up in the book are the ones that are there not only for color and for how fascinating they're going to make the book, but often because they're the underserved characters in the popular imagination. The one you mentioned at the beginning, Maria Sibylla Merian, is not known as well as she should be. She's really kind of the great-great-great-grandmother of entomology and should be known as such. She's a pivotal figure in the history of science, and her legacy is just beginning to emerge. And I wanted to be part of helping that to happen. She was born in Germany in 1647, and in 1699, she traveled with her young daughter, Dorothea. Maria was 44 at the time, to Suriname, which was a Dutch colony in South America, a brutal place full of slave labor, sugar plantations, cotton growing. But she went there to study insects and plants and some other animals, but mostly because she was extremely intrigued by the lives of insects. And it was the first purely scientific expedition that a European took to the Americas. And she funded it entirely by selling her own paintings. She sold 225 of her own paintings, got on board a hulking ship, sailed for 3 months across the Atlantic, and she and her daughter paddled dugout canoes deep into Suriname and did these unbelievably beautiful illustrations of insects. And she published a book later called The Metamorphosis of Insects that came out in Europe and totally revolutionized entomology as an emerging field at the time in the 17th century. The two things that she did that were truly remarkable and radical were, one, she showed insects in all the stages of their life cycles. At the time, people actually thought that larvae, pupa, adult insects were actually different organisms. And Maria's illustration showed the insect moving through its phases of metamorphosis. The second thing that Maria Sibylla Merian did that was remarkable and revolutionized science at the time was she showed insects in their ecological context. She showed them on their host plants and often in the environments in which they were living in Suriname. And it had been tradition prior to that to extract species, put them on a blank background. You may know Albrecht Dürer's famous illustration of a stag beetle. It's a beetle, 1505, shown on a blank background. But what Maria did is she put these organisms in their ecological context. And that was revolutionary at the time because it began to see organisms as part of much larger ecological systems. This wasn't ecological thinking per se at the time, but it was a real leap forward. And so in choosing to include her story, it's not only a lovely story about humans interacting with insects, but I really wanted to showcase a historical figure who has not yet attained the notoriety that they should for all that she did to advance the study of insects in history.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the research in this book. Reading it for the second time, I've really been staggered by the sheer breadth of material that you've covered and how much time and how many places. When you think back about the research, what was the most challenging question that you had to answer that took the most time to sleuth out?
Good question. It was probably the shellac chapter, because both the cochineal chapter and the silk chapter are well within my wheelhouses, so to speak. I started graduate school as a Chinese historian and had been trained by a great Chinese historian at Swarthmore, Lillian Lee, who's an expert on silk production, and silk, of course, is deeply linked to Chinese history. And I was also trained by a great Latin American historian, Gil Joseph, at Yale. and I had learned about the cochineal trade through him. But shellac was new to me, and nobody's really written much on it. So I found myself sleuthing among very obscure Indian journals. Shellac is produced on fig and acacia trees in India and Thailand and parts of Southeast Asia. And so it was really kind of a forensic detective story to track down the background for the shellac chapter. And it was the most exciting in some ways, because what I ended up finding, as I did with cochineal and silk, is that the product of this insect secretion is ubiquitous. It's with us all the time in everyday products. If you go to the grocery store and you pick up a shiny apple, it's probably coated in shellac. Shellac is the food additive that keeps things looking shiny on the shelves, and it's non-toxic, so it can be added to foods. Whenever a kid goes trick-or-treating on Halloween, the candy that they're eating is coated in an insect product. That's the shellac. Cochineal's in everything. It's always fun to give lectures to my students and look out across the audience, and there's invariably somebody there eating fruit on the bottom yogurt, somebody else eating an apple, and I can point out that they're all eating insect products, because the red in the fruit on the bottom yogurt is produced through cochineal dye, and that's a secretion of an insect. And then their apple is probably shellacked, and that's another insect secretion. And I even had the experience of having several football players in my class munching on exo protein bars, and they hadn't looked closely at the wrappers and had not yet realized that the protein in their bars that they were eating after their practice was made from cricket flour, which are the freeze-dried, pulverized bodies of house crickets. So all around us, there are insects, and they're in everything, you know, from when you listen to the resonant tones of a Stradivarius violin, the wood has been coated in shellac. And of course, silk, we all know from the fashion industry, is another one of those now everyday products that's all around us. And yet we often don't stop to acknowledge this presence of insects in almost every facet of our daily lives. The great one was, I was sitting in a dentist chair at one point and was getting sort of a filling for where I was beginning to get a cavity. And I asked the dentist if I could look at the ingredients on the bottle of the substance they were using to fill this little gap in my tooth. And the dentist looked at me quizzically and said, "Why do you want to look at that?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book on insect products and the way that they come and go in our daily lives. And I'm going to bet that there's some shellac in here." And indeed, he showed me the bottle and there was shellac in the dental filling. I've had the same experience at the hairdresser, where they didn't know that many of the products they're spraying on people's hair actually contain shellac as a fixative. And so it's a lot of fun to talk about this book with folks and see what their reactions are as they begin to realize that, yes, insects really are inside us, on us, and around us at all times.
Well, there was a great deal that surprised me reading the book, including on the second go-through, ranging from Japanese samurai's reverence for certain insects, the dragonfly among them, to the prevalence of biopiracy in the early modern world. What was the thing that was the most surprising to you that you discovered in doing this research?
Well, I'll tell you a small thing and then a big thing. And the small thing is actually an experiment you can do. I hope it's not too late and too cold to do this little experiment. But next time you hear a cricket chirping, count its chirps for 14 seconds, then add 40 to that number and write the number down that you get. You'll be very surprised, but you'll get a remarkably accurate approximation of the current temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. I'll tell you that one more time. It was a lot to follow. Count the cricket's chirps for 14 seconds, write that number down, and then add 40 to that number. And you'll get, if you check the temperature outside in degrees Fahrenheit, you'll get within 1 or 2 degrees of that. That was actually quite surprising to me, but I come to that in the end of the book. I have an epilogue called Listening to Insects. and the epilogue is both metaphorical and literal about why we need to be paying attention to what insects are telling us about the health of the planet, but also insects are able to tell us a remarkable array of other things about ourselves and about our world. And that is the big picture thing that really is the most surprising, how many stories insects have to tell us about our world. So it's both the little example in that particular case and the big picture story of just how many ways insects are speaking to us.
So, Ted, you introduced us to a lot of different insects in this book, and I know you've thought a lot about insects for the last couple of years writing it. Which one is your favorite now, and why? And don't say Jiminy Cricket.
Well, I will say the cricket, though, because I really do think the most intriguing for me is the house cricket. And that's because as I pored over the literature about insects, the degree to which prognosticators are staking the future of the global food supply on house is truly remarkable. You may know nothing about this, but everyone is putting their bets on cricket meal. And these are just freeze-dried, pulverized house cricket that are ground up into powder and are baked into things. And this is where everybody's putting their dollars. Bill Gates, Mark Cuban, the billionaire who's on Shark Tank, Biz Stone, the co-founder of Twitter, they're all putting their bets on house crickets. And the reason for this in large part is that we're on an incredibly inefficient path as regards to meat production globally. In the United States, it takes about 1,000 gallons of water and 2 acres of grazing land to produce a pound of beef. It takes to produce 1 pound of crickets only 1 gallon of water and about 2 cubic feet of space. And for the crickets, you get about 3 times the amount of protein, much more iron, and a much richer nutrient profile. So if you're thinking about efficiency here, how is the world going to feed itself? And we're going to hit a population of about 9 billion by 2050. There's some serious problems with continuing to feed the world the way we're doing it. And so the house cricket may end up being kind of a pivotal insect in the future of the world's food supply. And just all of the approaches to that were truly fascinating to me. Scientists are thinking about it. Literary scholars are even thinking about what it means that we might be staking our future on eating insects. And so I tried to put all of those different perspectives together in my chapter in the book on entomophagy, which is just the fancy term for eating insects.
Well, I really enjoyed the entomophagy chapter, and I want to go further in that direction if we can. When you're doing the research for it, how many of those 6-legged dishes did you actually try? And which one did you like the best? And which one do you plan to studiously avoid in the future?
So over the years, I've tried my share, although I have not tried all the ones I write about. I've never had a Madagascar hissing cockroach, although I have, I have tried chapulines. I was in Mexico in 1993 with a school group, and chapulines are basically fried grasshoppers coated liberally with chilies and squirts of lime, and they're delicious. They're fried on a flat fry pan in many Mexican cities called a comal, and they're just crunchy and even a bit sweet and quite tasty. Probably on the less favorite side of the insect repertoire for me is Bandongi, which I've had in Koreatown in San Francisco with my friend Jim. He encouraged me to try these out. And those are fried or steamed silkworm pupae. And you eat them in a little styrofoam cup with a toothpick. And they taste kind of like a cross between a peanut and a shrimp. And I wasn't in particular a fan of either that combination or the sort of crunch to goo ratio in the mouth. But they're considered a street delicacy in Korea. And it's worth pointing out that on our planet right now, 2 billion people eat insects as a regular part of their daily diet. and is not considered anything strange at all. And so in the book, I really talk about why it is that those of us in the West, the United States and Europe for the most part, have this antipathy towards eating insects, whereas most of the world includes 1, 2, 3, or 4 insect dishes in their hit list of their culinary mainstays.
One of the facts that you revealed very early on in the book that continues to surprise me is just how important insects are to environmental systems throughout the world on every continent. How has your own relationship with insects changed as you've read all of this material, digested it, and thought so much about not only how important insects are to our own survival, but to the fact that it's really impossible to avoid them despite all of the negative cultural baggage that they carry here in the United States? Has your feeling about insects and the creepy crawly factor modulated or changed during writing this book?
Well, you used the word digest, so I'll begin there. The great environmental historian Donald Worcester once said, "Environmental history begins in the belly." And I think that's very true. I'm drinking a cup of coffee right now, and in it is certainly insect body parts. The FDA allows a whole bunch of insect body parts in every pound of coffee, as they do with chocolate and peanut butter. And from doing the research on this project, I realized that I'm eating insects all the time, whether I acknowledge it or not. As I talked about with the fruit on the bottom yogurt and the apple, we're all eating insects all the time, whether we acknowledge it or not. But the flip side, not just digesting insects, is the important role that they play in the maintenance and survival of many ecological systems. To pan out for a moment, 1 in every 3 bites of food that the average human takes on this planet was pollinated by an insect. And that's a remarkable statistic if you let it sink in. And that's including everything, not just plants like coffee, tea, broccoli, avocados, almonds. Everything we eat was pollinated by insects. And we often don't think about that role that insects play in actually making possible our everyday existence on the planet. The book kind of ends, though, in thinking about, and this I think is to answer your question, the way in which my awareness has been elevated by doing this work, the precarious health of many insect communities and the way that indicates larger global problems. Right now on the planet, some 40% of insect species are endangered and 1/3 are in dramatic decline. And that's the harbinger of other problems that lie ahead for global ecosystems. Part of it is climate change, part of it is extreme habitat loss, the use of new types of pesticides like neonicotinoids, which are a class of pesticides that are remarkably destructive to insects. But we can really think of insects and their health as a barometer of larger processes globally and their health. And doing this work made me really understand that to a much greater degree than I had previously. We owe a lot to insects, and most of our knowledge about the human genome, in fact, is derived from the humble fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, and I talk about that in a chapter in the book. And trying to acknowledge those debts can be difficult when we've been given these stories of the truly destructive impacts that insects have had on humanity. But it's the discoveries of these other stories that really shined a light for me on the ways that our lives are inextricably intertwined with 6-legged creatures.
So just to build on that, I think we're getting toward the end of our time. I think we can squeeze in one more question. If there was one thing that you'd like to share with the audience, one takeaway from this talk, what would that be?
Ooh, well, I think what that would be is it really is time for us to become more aware of the importance of this group of non-human actors in maintaining life as we know it. the great entomologist, he was British, he was born in India, J.B.S. Haldane, was asked in the 1920s by a group of theologians, "Sir, what might you learn about the nature of the Creator from your studies of Earth?" And Haldane answered, "Well, he must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles." And the reason for that is there are 350,000 species of beetles, far more species as a group than any other animal on the planet. And they're doing all sorts of things that are often hidden from view. They're decomposing and decaying organic matter. They're moving organic matter around. They're involved in pollination, as it turns out. And it's this kind of hidden from view aspect about insect lives that I'm most intrigued by, and trying to bring that to light is what I hope in some small part this book does. And I also hope it's a fun read along the way.
All right, Rachel, I'll turn it over to you now.
I think that David has a question to kick off our audience Q&A portion of the evening. But audience members, if you have questions you would like to ask, please enter them in the chat and we'll read them out. Or if you'd like to ask a question on camera, send a note to either me or David and we will put you in the queue.
Yeah, well, this has been so fascinating. I know I'm gonna count some seconds and some crickets tonight with all the crickets that live in the various corners of my house. But I had a particular question. Thinking of the antipathy that the West has to eating insects, well, I mean, how do you answer our antipathy to eating insects? 2 billion people eat them elsewhere, but the fact that it's the West putting insects in all of our food too, in all of our, these products.
Well, there's some ways I've approached that in the book, and it's a challenging question to answer because there's no single right way to go about this. I mean, one of the highly probable reasons for this is largely the Americas were colonized by people who were coming from cold places where insects were not alive in abundance and were not part of their daily diets. Northern European colonists did not have strong traditions of eating insects. Another thing that's happened, though, is I think insects have become kind of a convenient device for Hollywood script writers, and in popular culture, they've become an easy way to move audiences into the otherworldly realm. And it's partly because insects strike us as so different in some ways. The exoskeleton, the wings, the antenna, the compound eyes. And so insects inhabit this strange realm that both seems prehistoric on the one hand and perhaps post-apocalyptic on the other. And Hollywood has made a lot of hay of that. The big bug movies of the 50s really took off and I think left a deep impression on popular culture about the destructive impacts of insects. And there's been a lot of great scholarship that has infused the popular imagination of all the wrong that insects have done to us. And there certainly is plenty to talk about. There's a great book by the historian John McNeill called Mosquito Empires, about all the ways that mosquitoes and malaria and yellow fever, which they carry, constrained the movements of empires throughout the larger Atlantic world in history. And so I think it's a combination of factors at work there. But I think that's the sort of backstory. I do feel like we're reaching some turning points, however. One of the fascinating tales that I uncovered is, while I was doing research for this project, was that chapulines, those fried grasshoppers I was telling you about from Mexico, are making major inroads on the menus at US ballparks. Safeco Field in Seattle, where the Seattle Mariners play, actually has a Mexican restaurant that is now vending chapulines. And according to the last count, which I think was 2018, had sold 110,000 servings of little baskets of fried grasshoppers to baseball fans. And so it may be that we're seeing a bit of a renaissance here in that North Americans and their European counterparts may start to embrace some of the more easy to taste varieties of insects in our, not necessarily our daily diets, but places where it's easier for them to disappear. The cricket flower is everywhere. If you go on Amazon and just look for cricket flour, you'll find at least 60 ingredients recipes that are constituted primarily cricket flour brownies, pancakes, biscuits made of cricket flour. And so that's another way in which entomophagy is entering popular culture surreptitiously. So I hope I answered your question to some extent there.
So next up, Julia is going to ask a question on camera, and Julia, you can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, Julia. Julia is my former student from Amherst College, so I'm just going to give her a shout out.
Professor, sorry, I'm sure you thought you were done with my questions and lecture a couple of years ago, but I have another one.
No,
Professor Melillo was one of the most influential professors that I had at Amherst, and has changed a lot of my perspective and has been such a wonderful mentor, just to give him a shout out as well. So my question's a bit long and has two parts to it, but in Botany of Desire, Michael Pollan challenges readers to get outside of the anthropocentric idea of evolution and consider the plant's perspective in sovereignty, and cites human desire in many forms as the target of this evolution. You start your book with the word fear, so I am curious as to which human vice, virtue, emotion you would designate as the insect's target for evolution. And then the second part, how do we consider this when with the future of entomography?
The future of entomophagy or entomography?
Entomophagy, sorry.
Good, because I'm not familiar with entomography. So about the first question, it's a really wonderful question that I could take in all sorts of directions, but I think one of the first ways I would take it is in thinking about coevolution with plants. Julia's bring up a wonderful book by Michael Pollan that talks about the history of marijuana, the tulip, the potato, and the apple, looking at the way that plants have co-evolved with humans. One of the really fascinating things that was also revealed when I did the research for this book was that this is a botanical story as much as it is a story about insects. Because the cultures that have been able to raise the shellac bug, the cochineal bug, and the silkworm had to have intimate knowledge of the plants on which those insects dine. In the case of cochineal, it's the nopal cactus. The female bug inserts her proboscis into the nopal cactus and extracts sugary water to feed her young. In the case of shellac, it's fig and acacia trees. And again, the female insect derives all of its nutrition from the plant to feed its young. And in the case of the silkworm, it's the mulberry tree. And the cultivators of these insects really became kind of the informal botanists of the early modern era and prior to that. And so the botanical story and the story of coevolution there was really one of the more fascinating tales that emerged. You can actually see kind of an arboreal legacy globally of where silkworms have been raised based on where there are the roots of mulberry trees that last for a long time after the trees themselves are dead. And they're in Western Massachusetts. They're all over Utah and the US Midwest. They're all over Italy. They're all over Turkmenistan. And these are all places where humans were co-evolving with insects and with plants to try and produce these products. In terms of emotions, though, I like to think of many of the traditional communities that were raising these insects as not motivated by fear at all. They were motivated by things like color and taste and smell and the other senses that went with consuming and seeing and feeling and tasting and touching these insect secretions. And it's really not until the 20th century that that emotion of fear begins to enter the discussion. Not that there wasn't fear of locust plagues or mosquitoes prior to the 20th century, but just that there's an array of other historical emotions at work in these cross-species interactions as well. I hope I'm getting at your question. I think the answer's in there somewhere. And then the second part was about the future of entomophagy. Where are we going?
Sorry, unmuting. Yes, and how it relates to the emotion of fear that we have now and that you cited in your book as well, and sort of how to potentially change that.
Yeah, there may be a borderlands between fear and necessity that will have to be surmounted and overcome. Necessity, not only that we need insects to eat them, because that seems like, you know, a fairly pragmatic and utilitarian approach, but a necessity that we also need insects for the survival of the planet in a much less utilitarian way as just sources of protein. We need them to maintain fundamental systems of plant reproduction, of the decay of organic matter, of the maintenance of all of these systems without which we can simply not operate on the surface of the earth. And so what I hope is that we will be crossing that borderland from fear into necessity. Doesn't mean that fear will cease to exist, but maybe we'll begin to acknowledge some of the ways in which this is a more pliable border than we'd previously thought. So I'll put it in terms of hope. That's the hope for that transcendence. And I think there are some signs of that. I talk in the book about the Xerxes Society, that is this remarkable conservation organization that's gaining popularity and has chapters all over the United States, all over Europe, and in other parts of the world that's focused on insect habitat conservation. And they're doing really great work. And I talk about their history and their legacy in the book. And that's one of many places where people can begin to interact with that more hopeful story of moving from fear perhaps into the understanding of necessity and coevolution. Did I answer that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I've got another question for you, Ted. You said you left a bunch of great stuff on the cutting room floor. What's the best story that couldn't make it into the book?
Oh, goodness. I'll have to think back, because my head is already around the next project I'm working on. But one of the more fascinating people I profiled, and I could easily have written a book entirely about him, is Charles Henry Turner, who was a 19th and early 20th century African-American entomologist who was the first Black man to have a paper published in Science. He was the first African-American to get a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago. And he faced tremendous discrimination throughout his career and was unable to get a job at a major research institution, and taught high school throughout the latter part of his life. And I think one of the biggest stories that got left on the cutting room floor was a biography of him. I accumulated enough material that I could have written a whole book about him. And I find him absolutely fascinating. I paired his story in this book with the story of Karl von Fritsch, who was a Jewish entomologist who also gave us a series of remarkable lessons about how bees pollinate. And he was persecuted by the Nazis during the Second World War. And their two stories of the discrimination they faced throughout their lives and the struggles that they went through to get this knowledge about bees to the wider public was really fascinating. And it could be a double biography or a book just about Charles Henry Turner. But I think of all the things I had to leave behind, I had to shorten their stories a bit to pack them into the space of a chapter. But I think that would be at the top of my list.
So we don't have a ton of time left, but I wondered if you wouldn't mind wrapping things up by telling us a little bit about the new project that you're working on, a little teaser of what you're researching these days.
Well, the little teaser is that the next book is going to be about another very different topic, but in some ways related to similar themes. The next book is actually about Moby Dick. It's about Herman Melville and the making of the great American novel. And I do a lot of work on the Pacific world, as my work on Chile and California might suggest, which is the Pacific Ocean and the cultures, ecosystems, and people who live in and around that vast space. And the next book follows Herman Melville's journeys as Moby Dick was lost to history and then refound again in the 20th century. So that's the little teaser about that project, but I'll leave it there because I don't want to give away too much.
That is very fair. I wondered, one last question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Your previous book was written for an academic publisher and an academic audience, presumably. And this new book was written for Knopf and a more, which is still a very literary and serious-minded publisher, but it's a conventional trade publisher marketing out to the general public, not just a scholarly audience. Did you find yourself writing differently, knowing that you were writing for a different audience, or was the process largely the same for you?
The process was really, really different. And I had a great editor on my first book. Jean Thompson Black at Yale is wonderful. And she really helped me a lot in putting that narrative together. But I also had wonderful editing on this book of a different type from John Siegel, who's really a master of helping an author shape their writing. And what I wanted to do is really make my ideas legible to a wider public and find ways to tell stories that would enthrall and surprise people without losing track of the big picture claims and arguments that I wanted to be making. And to John's credit, one of the things he's so remarkable at doing is helping an author keep track of both things, that you don't need to lose the tricky arguments, but you can find ways to make them approachable through story. And one of the big arguments in the book that I didn't really get into here is that many of these insect commodities that we think of as associated with ancient times or the pre-modern past have made a remarkable resurgence in recent years. And I didn't want to lose track of why that was and telling readers about that. And so one of the things John helped me do is figure out how to use stories and narrative to keep making those big claims while also doing the deep dives and the detours into the anecdotes and the exciting little twists and turns that will keep people coming back for more so they don't get dissuaded by the fact that I want to make big claims and big arguments here. I'm also going to keep you captivated. And I hope the book is able to do that. I certainly tried to do that, and I had a lot of fun shaping it to accomplish that task.
Very cool. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are just about out of time. So Ted and Ben, thank you so much. This was a truly fascinating evening. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much, audience. It was great to see some new faces and some familiar old faces and to see you all here together this evening. Please come on back for another Northshire Live event. We've got a great debut short story collection tomorrow. And then more great events next week, including Mazla Mengist, who was longlisted or shortlisted for the book prize. So come on back. We'll see you again soon. And Ted and Ben, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thanks to you all. Thanks again, Ben.
Thank you, Ted.
Bye, Mom. Bye, Dad.
Thank you so much. The book is The Butterfly Effect.
Right. There it is.